Over 100 years ago, in a small Pennsylvania town, archaeologists unearthed something strange. Something so strange that it would go on to threaten the very foundations of civilization itself. Archaeologists were forced to either cover it up or explain it, and explain it they could not, so cover up it was. And this brings us to the Horned Skulls of Pennsylvania. Before we get started, let's take a closer look at the skull in this picture. In a 2015 book entitled Giants on Record, the authors Jim Vieira and Hugh Newman hired an investigator to track down the origins of this skull. Researcher Micah Ewers was the man tasked with this investigation. After an exhaustive search, he was able to conclude that in 1959, the skull was acquired by the Canadian Museum of Supernatural History. Taken from the website of the skull's owner, quote, "Horned human skull, probably a relic of a satanic cult or a cult devoted to the god Pan. Although we thought the object had been cleverly manufactured, an analysis has demonstrated that the horns are genuinely part of the skull. An in-depth examination and x-rays leave no room for doubt. The skull is not a forgery." Giant skeletons of horned men were also exhumed in Pennsylvania in the 1880s. Like the skull presented on this site, the horns began above the eye sockets. End quote. In the book, The Secret Teaching of All Ages, famous occultist Manly P. Hall states, quote, "Pan was a composite creature, the upper parts, with the exception of his horns, being human, and the lower parts in the form of a goat. The pipes of Pan signify the natural harmony of the spheres, and Pan himself is a symbol of Saturn because he is enthroned in Capricorn." In Sumerian mythology, the god Enki was symbolized by a horned goat. Enki was known as Ea in the Babylonian tradition. The word Enki is believed to mean Lord of the Earth. In this video I shot at Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, you can see these same exact horned creatures carved into the canyon walls. These petroglyphs date back over 1,000 years. Everywhere we look is the same story. People have been worshipping these horned beings all throughout history and right up into the present day. It is my contention that these people use the horn symbolism as a way to pay homage to Lucifer by glorifying the events that took place before the flood of Noah. In those days, fallen angels used genetic manipulation and forbidden technology to create a race of unauthorized creatures. Horrible creatures that would go on to wreak havoc on the earth, corrupting everything they came in contact with. Until one day, when God told Noah, quote, "The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." End quote. After the flood, however, something very strange happened. From the book of Numbers, chapter 13, verse 33, quote, "We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." End quote. Could this horned skull be used to prove the existence of these creatures? Let's take a look. On July 14th, 1916, the New York Times published an article entitled "Scientists Unearth Relics of Indians Who Lived Over 700 Years Ago." And I quote, "Professor A.B. Skinner of the American Indian Museum, Professor W.K. Moorhead of the Philip Andover Academy, and Dr. George Donahue, Pennsylvania State Historian, who have been conducting research along the Susquehanna, have uncovered an Indian mound at Tioga Point, on the upper portion of the Queen Earth Flats, on what is known as the Murray Farm, a short distance from Syrie, Pennsylvania. which promises to add rich additions to Indian lore. In the mound uncovered were found the bones of 68 men who were believed to be buried 700 years ago. The average height of these men was 7 feet tall, while many were much taller. Further evidence of their gigantic size was found in large celts or axes hewed from stone and buried in the grave. On some of the skulls, 2 inches above the perfectly formed foreheads were protuberances of bone. Members of the expedition say that this is the first discovery of its kind on record and a valuable contribution to the history of the early races. The skull and a few of the bones found in the grave were sent to the American Indian Museum. So what the New York Times is telling us is that archaeologists found a colony of giants, some of which had horns on their head, and a collection of giant tools and weapons that no ordinary person could wield. As you can imagine, this article rippled through the scientific community like a tidal wave, and panic set in. This forced Professor A.B. Skinner, who was one of the main archaeologists conducting the dig, to write to the New York Times and say that they were mistaken and that there were no horned skulls found. He later wrote this in his book, and I quote, "In an ingenious fashion by its owner, it was not 3/4 of a yard like those Captain Smith admired, which were evidently effigy pipes, as he said. They had a bird or deer or some such device on the great end and sufficient to beat out one's brains. While the writer was present, one of the men working in the grave exclaimed, 'There are horns over its head.' Mr. Skinner said that it indicated chieftainship. Later, this was found to be a bundle burial, completely covered with Virginia deer antlers. A passing visitor, however, heard the explanation and attempted to verify by interrogating a fun-loving Maine woman, and a story was printed coast to coast that one or more skulls had been found with horns growing on its forehead." End quote. So his explanation is that they were deer antlers, and the New York Times only wrote the article after hearing someone yell out, "They have horns"? Interesting. Let's see if we can find any more reports of horned skulls found during excavations in early America. As it turns out, this is not the only report of giant skeletons and horned skulls. Reports are numerous, and they date back to the 1800s and span all across America. Taken from the Hawking Sentinel, April 28, 1898, Toledo, Ohio. 3 giant skeletons, quote, "Workmen in the employ of the Ferguson Construction Company excavating for the Toledo and Ottawa Beach Railroad, a little beyond the city limits of Toledo, Ohio, unearthed 3 giant skeletons, evidently relics of some great race, as they were about 7 feet in length, and just where the ears should be, on the head are singular bony protuberances which curl forward. These finds were made in solid yellow clay, about 8 feet below the surface. The cut is through a large mound, not half of which has been torn up yet. Several stone tomahawks of large size have been picked up in locality." End quote. Here is another one from the Minnesota News, December 6, 1905. Giant bones unearthed. Horns on skull of skeleton found in Indiana. Quote, "Kingston, Indiana, December 5th. Bones of a primitive giant have been unearthed by Alonzo Lewis, a farmer living near Sulphur Springs. The skeleton is more than 7 feet in length, and the skull has horns about 1.5 inches long, projecting upwards from the point just behind the ears. Several similar skeletons have been found here in the past few weeks. All of the peculiar bones were found in the gravel pit on Lewis Farm." End quote. This report was from 1910 to 1911 and is from Topanga Canyon, California, where around 44 skeletons were unearthed, and each has a horned-like development 3 inches long. Reports like these are becoming more and more rare due to the control of information and the manipulation of history. Institutions like the Smithsonian have been instrumental in covering up these discoveries. But that's another video for another day. Thank you all for watching. God bless you all.